Hi, I'm Casey Seiler. I'm the editor of the Times-Union, and I'm here with three outstanding journalists to talk about what happened in Albany on Monday afternoon and evening, specifically a protest outside of the police station on the north side of town, basically in between Arbor Hill and the neighborhood known as West Hill. I am joined by Michael Williams, who serves on our business desk, but was there in the evening. Massarah Mikati, who was at the demonstration during the afternoon hours, and Ken Crowe, who usually covers Troy and Rensselaer County, but was there. That's Massarah's dog in the earlier evening. So, Massarah, we should probably start with you. What was going on when you arrived at the police station on Henry Johnson Boulevard?
So the protest was actually not in front of the police station when I got there. It was right at the intersection of Henry Johnson and Livingston. So it was blocking off. Henry Johnson going on to 90 East and the highway. So, you know, it was just a huge group of protesters. I would say at least 50 people, maybe 100. I'm not usually the best at gauging these things, though. Standing in the middle of the intersection. The first thing that really struck me when I got there was just this communal outpouring of grief.
It ain't just about Black Lives Matter. We are human lives and we matter. It ain't just about a title. We are human.
It was this energy that reverberated through the air. And, you know, you had your typical thing that you'd be expecting people at the megaphones, but I get there and I'm walking up to the crowd and I see Chief Eric Hawkins, Albany Police Chief Eric Hawkins, standing in the middle of this crowd. And, which was quite telling because he wasn't there on Saturday during Saturday's protest. So everyone seemed to be really ready to have conversations with him and air their frustrations with him. Because the reality, and this was the theme that was spoken of multiple times during Monday afternoon's protest, is that everyone has their own George Floyd. And what happened to George Floyd in Minneapolis has happened to young Black men and even Black women in the capital region. And so throughout all the protests that I've gone to so far, people are bringing up their own George Floyds. And that was exactly what happened on Monday afternoon when they were talking to Chief Hawkins. One protester brought up to him the First Street incident last year with Officer Luke Deere and frustration with how he handled the officers in that incident. So someone else brought up Elazar Williams, who was shot and paralyzed by a police officer while running away from the scene. So, you know, there are multiple names that are being brought up, and Chief Hawkins was faced with that. And it was an interesting moment for me to watch Chief Hawkins because he took the megaphone eventually after trying to respond, and people were upset with him, saying his responses were too political. He took the megaphone and he said he wanted to share his story.
I get social injustice. I get because I've heard the stories from my parents. I've heard it from my grandparents.
Did you live it?
I lived it. I lived it.
And he talked about how, as a Black man himself, he, his parents, his grandparents have all experienced racial injustice. And that's why he decided to become a police officer, because change has to come from within the system. His story didn't really seem to satisfy the protesters because at the end of the day, you know, one protester yelled out at him, "You can't control them. You can't control your officers." So it was definitely really heated. And then, you know, Hawkins left the scene. The megaphone was taken away from him. Well, he handed it off. And then one protester said, "We're not here for Hawkins' story. We're here for our stories." And then that's when more protesters started taking to the megaphone and telling their own stories of fear, you know, fear for their lives, fear for their bodies. So one woman who took the megaphone said that she's always afraid. Every morning when she goes to work, she's afraid to go to work. When her husband leaves to go to work, she's even more afraid. She said, "We shouldn't be afraid to walk down the block. We shouldn't be afraid to send our kids to the neighborhood basketball court." And so this is what I mean when I say this energy of grief and pain was just hanging in the air on Monday afternoon. Everyone was sharing their stories. And then at one point, one of the protesters took the megaphone and said, let's all get down on the ground like George Floyd. Let's see how much of a threat he could have been. Everyone went down on their stomachs. They put their hands behind their backs to emulate what George Floyd may have been feeling. Some protesters started screaming out, I can't breathe. Other protesters were screaming out, mama, mama, as George Floyd screamed out, as we could see in the video of him. And then one of the protesters, one of the organizers said, okay, now let's stand up. George Floyd couldn't stand up, but we can stand up. And everyone stood up together. So it was, it ended up being, it ended a little bit more heated, I'd say, than it began. Some of the organizers wanted the protest to end. They wanted to open the streets back up. Other protesters felt like that wasn't enough. We want to do more. We want to keep protesting. We want to keep making sure our voices are heard. And by that point, my phone was at 1%. So I ended up going home.
Ken, when did you get to the scene?
Well, I was at the police station before 8 o'clock. By then, the crowd had arrived, but they had been marching through the city. Lauren Spector, who was the editor working last night, and I had been tracking them because obviously there's a lot going on. And they were up at North Allen and Central, and from there headed back to the police station. When I arrived at the police station, there were about 300 to 400 gathered. And Hawkins, the chief, was back out front talking to the crowd, talking to a small group that gathered around him. And there was another African-American officer also talking, and there were two female African-American officers who were out in the crowd with a patrol cart also speaking to people. Now, at that time, the Albany Police Department had, it looked anywhere from 70 to 100 officers deployed, but they were hidden on Oak Street behind police headquarters. Think of Henry Johnson Boulevard, the police headquarters, and then Oak Street is the next block to the west. And back there, if you walked up 2nd Street, because you couldn't get down 1st Street, it was blocked off, you could see the officers in riot gear, the horses. It was a mix of Albany police and New York State troopers. Now, the police station itself, police headquarters, had a ring of barriers. There was a metal railings set up on the street. Then behind that were orange street, the barriers you would see at a construction site. And then behind that, there were some planters. So you had 3 rows of defense before you got to the front entrance to the building. I had to leave also to briefly to reload my phone, repower it. But when I was there for about 45 minutes, they were just milling around the crowd. They didn't know what to do. They were talking. There was no one appeared to be in charge. When I came back, they had moved down 2nd Street to Oak, and the police had deployed. They were in a line along blocking 1st Street at the intersection with Henry Johnson. There were officers lining the front of the police headquarters on Henry Johnson. Then down 2nd Street, they were spread out, and then the police were lined solidly up. The state troopers together, the Albany police together, and overhead was a drone. And Hawkins was speaking to the crowd. Now, the crowd was thinning out. It had dropped. It was dropping fairly quickly. They were leaving in groups of 2 to 4. There was some shouting. At one point, they called for the mayor. One of the city council members came out of the crowd and spoke to them on over the police loudspeaker in one of the cars. And some of the people were upset because there was an Albany police officer who was taking pictures of the crowd, which is quite common at demonstrations for the police to gather intelligence and see who's there. Having been to other events like this over the years, you see that. And you also learn to look to the back of the crowd, because when things are thrown, they're not coming from the front lines, they're from the back. And those who saw the videos on Saturday night and the Sunday morning at the Albany South Station, you could see that was what was happening. Now, I was there until roughly 9:30. The crowd was breaking up more and more. There was a small clump of people in front of the chief who had continued talking to him, but he had backed off, and one of the officers had actually handed him a helmet at one point. And I left, nothing had happened yet, and there had been some shouting. They had called, as I said, they had called for the mayor, but it looked like it was winding down, but it was getting darker. And that's when things start to happen in these situations. That's when the police deployed, because evening had fallen. And Michael can take it from there, because everything broke a half an hour after I left.
And now, Michael, we should point out that yesterday was your day off, correct?
Well, it wasn't my day off. I worked during the day, but I felt like
But
I really had to.
you were not there on assignment. You were there basically observing, correct?
Yes, it was.
So what time did you arrive, and what did you see, and when, in your estimation, did the scene escalate?
I arrived to the police station at about 6:30, thereabouts. The crowd was pretty much what Massarah described, very, very peaceful, very passionate. There was a dialogue going on between both the crowd and Chief Hawkins and other police officers that he put on the front line. Around 7 o'clock, people started walking through the crowd saying, if you have children, go home. If you're a child, go home, no kids. So much of the crowd kind of followed that directive and started thinning out. Around 7:30, I would say, and throughout this entire situation, you had the crowd asking Chief Hawkins to take a knee. Chief Hawkins took a knee a few times, and so did a lot of the other officers he was with. But the crowd wanted to see every police officer take a knee. So even the ones who were like back in the Albany police, in the actual station, they wanted to see them also take a knee. I heard Chief Hawkins say that, a lot of his officers didn't really know what the purpose, what the symbolism of the knee was. And he said that, if he could talk to his officers about that, then they could coordinate something with the protesters, but not that afternoon. So he was saying we could coordinate something tomorrow, but the crowd really wanted to see the officers sort of take a knee in solidarity with their message. Around 7:30, 8 o'clock is when the situation really started changing. Somebody in the back of the crowd set off an M80, and you could just kind of see Chief Hawkins throw up his hands and then walk back into the police station. And that's when a lot of the chanting started and the crowd started getting really passionate. After that is when the crowd moved around to the side of the police station on Oak Street. And like Ken said, the dialogue continued with Chief Hawkins and with Councilman Jamal Robinson. Again, the crowd wasn't really, and one thing that's really important to keep in mind is that, this crowd isn't really homogenous with what they want. You have different factions who want different things and who see different means to achieve, their message. So you had one part of the crowd was asking all the officers to take a knee, even the ones in riot gear, and then the other crowd was like, what's the symbolism of taking the knee? That doesn't really help. What our communities have been through over the past few years. So a lot of the crowd didn't really see the purpose of taking the knee. And then you had one incident where it appeared that a lot of the officers who were dressed in riot gear, as both New York State Police and Albany police officers, it appeared that they were taking a knee, but what they were really doing was just taking the gas mask out of the pouch that was strapped to their leg and putting it on their face. So that really, really, really upset a lot of protesters who felt like the police were sort of mocking their movement and what they were asking for. Night fell. I'm not exactly sure what started the confrontation. I noticed a lot of people in the crowd started running. I'm not really sure what caused them to start running. But then is when I saw a firework thrown toward the police, and that's sort of when it got really hairy. Tear gas. Some protesters said that they were hit by rubber bullets. And from what I could see 3 protesters who were clearly injured. One just got an enormous whiff of tear gas right into the face. One was bleeding down from the face, looked like he had a head injury, and one was limping. So that's when the situation really started escalating.
And that, of course, is when I saw your tweets and made the questionable decision to drive down there. So I parked about a half a block west of Henry Johnson on First Street and walked down to the point where First Street hits Henry Johnson, and completely by accident walked into a very fraught scene. And Michael, as it turned out, you were on the other side of First Street from me, and I did not even see you there amid the kind of chaos. And what I saw was two cops standing next to an SUV that was kind of diagonal on First Street. And these two cops, who essentially were about a block away from the big crowd of police that were north by the police station, were being harangued by a group of young men who were screaming at them, saying, take a knee, not in solidarity, but clearly in sort of a kind of command fashion. And these cops realized that they were, as it were, kind of far in front of the troops, as it were. And at one point, one of the young men took a box spring that had been on the road a couple of feet away, set it on fire, and attempted to kind of shove it up against the police SUV, quite likely with the intention of trying to set the SUV on fire, perhaps. At that point, the line of police swept down, mounted cops on horseback, a very large military-style, troop vehicle, all came south on Henry Johnson, and that is where a lot more tear gas was set off, and in addition to a lot of flashbang grenades. Would you add anything to that description of that episode?
You pretty much have it down pat. That's exactly what happened. I will add that, first the tear gas dispersed the crowd, and then it was really interesting to see the crowd regroup and then just steadily march. And one thing that was really interesting throughout this entire night, you hear calls of white people to the front of the crowd. And so you had the white protesters basically forming a human chain between the police and the rest of the crowd. And that's what I saw on one of the sort of marches toward the police line. Entire crowd had their hands up, chanting, hands up, don't shoot. And then that's when the police deployed a couple of flashbang grenades and some additional tear gas, and the crowd ran again. And so that process sort of repeated itself a few times throughout the night.
And after that, you went back to your car to power up your phone again. Powering up your phone is becoming a motif for all the reporters telling the story.
I'm bringing a portable charger next time.
Yes, exactly. I, meanwhile, trying to get away from the tear gas because I got quite a dose, went north to the police station and then west, basically doing a big circle to get back to my car. When I got back to my car, my windshield was bashed, and it was, it was very freaky. There were people on their stoops who had been tear gassed, who were in great distress. A lot of people crying. A lot of people in that neighborhood, obviously, very, very angry. That neighborhood is not particularly well illuminated, and it was dark, and it was very fraught, without a doubt. I got back to my car and I drove home, and I called you and told you to go home too, which I don't know if you needed that much encouragement at that point. And of course, what happened after that, there was, significant action of people who went to Central Avenue, and there was damage done, and there was some looting done as well. But of course, that was done by a very small contingent of people who might or might even not have been part of the demonstration. So, what else? What are one other motif of this, beyond not having enough cell phone power, is the fact that this seemed to be a demonstration with a lot of anger, not a lot of leadership, or not a lot of leadership that was consistent over the course of the demonstration. Would anybody disagree with that? You guys were all there for the demonstration. I was just there for the unpleasant ending.
Well, I think that was the point. I think that it wasn't supposed to be a hierarchical event. These protests are supposed to be from the community for the community. And so I think especially on Monday, you know, Saturday's protest was well planned out. Monday's protest, I just heard about it last minute and ran up there. And it was really like a grassroots organized protest. But then when you have people already out there and already starting to open that wound and share their feelings and their emotions, they don't want to stop after 2 hours. Some people don't want to stop after 2 hours. Some people just want to keep going. And that's where it really is spontaneous and spur of the moment. I think Michael made a really good point, which was that there's not, you know, unanimity among the crowd on what exactly some people want. There is on how they feel, but not exactly what they want. And so, you know, when I was there in the afternoon, they also asked Chief Hawkins to take a knee, and he did, and people still weren't satisfied. And so I think there's kind of this tension between symbolic support for the movement, the cause, their feelings, their experiences, but also systemic change to stop this from happening again. And so after Hawkins took a knee, one of the protesters said, although the police chief may have taken a knee, we won't be pacified by that symbolism because an apology has changed behavior. And you had other protesters, you know, there was one protester formerly incarcerated at the age of 15 for being involved in an assault. And he said to the police chief when talking about the First Street incident, at 15 years, I served 7 years in jail, and you're telling me you just suspended grown men while another man was being beaten with a stick. And so one other woman said, we're being overly policed and you're being underly policed, and that's the problem. So you're hearing from the crowd that the symbolism isn't enough. We want you to make these systemic changes. We want you to hold police officers accountable in these situations of police brutality. And it was really insightful.
That's great. Needless to say, I really appreciate all of your good work and being out there, even if in Michael's case you were off the clock at that point. And I would remind anybody who's listening to this that all of these reporters were out there while also dealing with the challenge of being on a scene, being out in public at a time of a global pandemic, which presents all kinds of risks and concerns as well. So thanks very much for being there and you know, presenting the first draft of history for this very, very difficult time.